Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cracking open a pretty fascinating, not to mention dusty, archaeological case file. We're going to be looking at the ancient history of figures like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Did they actually exist? And if they did, what did their world really look like? Well, by looking at the hard evidence pulled straight from the dirt of the ancient Near East, we can actually start to visualize the reality of these Genesis narratives. Understanding our past this way doesn't just verify history, It helps us understand the absolute foundations of human resilience and belief. So let's dive right in. To piece together this complex historical puzzle, we're going to follow a quick 5-part roadmap. First, we'll look at the patriarchal debate. Second, dating the ancient journey. Third, clues in the texts. Fourth, uncovering ancient cities. And finally, artifacts of daily life. Starting off with part 1, the patriarchal debate. And yeah, it is a controversial history. We really have to begin our dossier by acknowledging that the historical existence of the patriarchs is a highly debated subject among modern archaeologists. It's a really complex conversation. So there are basically two main camps here. On one side, you've got the highly skeptical view, which is represented by scholars like Tommy Thompson and John Van Zeters. They point out that we completely lack direct contemporary named evidence for these specific figures, and that leads them to question their historicity entirely. But on the flip side, we have the supportive view championed by scholars like John Bimson and K.A. Kitchen. They argue that, sure, direct evidence is sparse, but there's a mounting pile of circumstantial and cultural evidence that actually aligns perfectly with the biblical accounts. As we go through this explainer, we're just going to look at the data neutrally and see exactly what it is these scholars are analyzing. A great starting point is seeing just how deep the roots of these patriarchal figures go in regional history. The traditional burial site of the patriarchs, the Cave of Machpelah down in Hebron, is a perfect example. It's surrounded by this massive, monumental stone structure that was actually built by Herod the Great around 2,000 years ago, specifically to honor the Hebrew patriarchs. The crazy part? The subterranean caves beneath that structure weren't even explored in modern times until right after the Six-Day War. That's when a very skinny Israeli girl managed to slip through a tiny hole in the floor to investigate the complex down below. Moving right along to part 2, dating the ancient journey. If these figures existed, our next investigative step is pinning down exactly when they traveled the Fertile Crescent. Now, pinning down an exact date in ancient history is notoriously difficult, but archaeologists have established a likely window. We're looking at the very end of the early Bronze Age, around 2100 to 2000 BC, stretching into the first half of the Middle Bronze Age, which ends roughly around 1550 BC. So that's the massive chronological playground we're operating in when we search for evidence of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But, of course, this brings up a rather massive question. If these men were really as important as the texts say, commanding large entourages and vast wealth, why haven't we found Abraham's name carved into a giant Egyptian temple wall or maybe an ancient Mesopotamian stone stele? It is a totally fair question. Well, the answer lies in their lifestyle. The absolute crucial point here is that we have to remember who we're tracking. We are reading the history of a single, migrating, nomadic family. We aren't tracking a royal dynasty that had massive state-sponsored building projects. Nomads moving across the Levant simply do not leave behind the kind of monumental written records that settled empires do. The chances of digging up a piece of stone from 2000 BC that explicitly says Abraham slept here is basically zero. It's a great reminder that history isn't just written by monumental kings. It's also built by resilient families who are surviving totally off the grid. Okay, part 3, clues in the texts. Because we lack those direct monumental names, we essentially have to become archaeological detectives and rely on circumstantial evidence. We have to look for textual clues that ground these stories in the very specific reality of the 2nd millennium BC. Take the number 20, for example. When Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, the text specifies he was sold for exactly 20 silver shekels. Why does that matter? Well, scholar K.A. Kitchen did some extensive studies on the going rate for slaves throughout the ancient Near East across different time periods, and he discovered that 20 silver shekels perfectly matches the going rate for a young male slave in the early 2nd millennium BC. It's an incredibly precise, mundane economic detail that fits the era flawlessly. We also find these fascinating little breadcrumbs in what are known as the execration texts. These were ancient Egyptian bowls or figurines that had the names of Egypt's enemies written all over them, and then they were ceremonially smashed to curse those enemies. What's amazing is that these texts mention a place called Salem, and Salem is widely understood to be an early name for Jerusalem. This confirms that the city existed exactly as it's described in the Genesis story. right when Abraham meets that mysterious king-priest, Melchizedek, the king of Salem. And the art from that period really brings these ancient migrations to life. Take the Beni Hassan tomb painting, which dates roughly to the exact era we're talking about. It depicts Asiatics, basically people from Canaan, traveling down into Egypt to trade livestock and metal. This perfectly visualizes the dynamic we see described over and over in the texts, where patriarchal families migrated from Canaan to Egypt just to survive severe famines. It proves that this kind of cross-border movement was absolutely a documented reality of the time. Which brings us to part 4, uncovering ancient cities. Our investigation moves from ancient texts and tomb paintings straight into the physical dirt of the Levant. We're looking for the cities of the plain. For years, expeditions have been vigorously scouring the regions surrounding the Dead Sea for these 5 fabled cities: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, which is also known as Zoar. The ultimate goal here is to see if the archaeology on the ground actually lines up with the geography described in the ancient texts regarding the story of Lot. And man, this has sparked a fascinating debate over exact locations. A major candidate for Sodom is a southern site called Bab ed-Dhra, near the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. Now, recently, some archaeologists have argued for a northern site called Tel Hammam, but the geography creates a massive roadblock for that northern site. In the narrative, Abraham looks out from his camp near Hebron and looks down upon Sodom. Geographically speaking, it is physically impossible to see the northern site of Tel Hammam from Hebron. So that makes the southern sites like Bab ed-Dhra a much better fit for the actual geography of the story. Finally, let's dive into part 5, Artifacts of Daily Life. It's time to look beyond the monuments and zoom in on the tactile, everyday reality. How did nomadic families actually survive in this harsh, unforgiving landscape thousands of years ago? When excavators dig into sites like Bab ed-Dhra, the things they unearth give us a direct window into that time. They found early Bronze Age pottery that is distinctly asymmetrical, and that's because it was handmade using coils, long before the fast potter's wheel was widely introduced. They also found heavy basalt mortars, which these families would have used day in and day out to painstakingly grind their grain and spices. As for shelter, well, they weren't building permanent stone houses. The patriarchs would have lived in traditional Bedouin-style tents. Now, we aren't talking about modern synthetic camping fabric here. This was tightly woven goat hair. And what is completely ingenious about goat hair is that the moment it rains, the fibers naturally swell up, making the entire tent completely waterproof. It's an incredibly engineered mobile home that has essentially remained unchanged for millennia. These tents were highly functional. Those distinct stripes woven into the fabric, those weren't just for decoration. They acted like ancient billboards, signaling tribal affiliations to anyone approaching from a distance. A rider would know instantly if they were approaching an ally for a hot meal or an enemy they needed to run from. And a wealthy leader like Abraham wouldn't have just had one little tent. He would have commanded massive multi-compartment versions with entirely separate areas for food prep, hospitality, and sleeping. Best of all, they could be broken down and moved at a moment's notice. Of course, actually traveling between those campsites was a grueling reality. Imagine riding a camel for hundreds of miles on an ancient wooden camel saddle. Even if you covered it with leather and blankets, that wooden frame was incredibly painful for anyone not totally used to it. And to eat on the road, they used suspended goat skins as butter churns. You'd fill it up with sheep or goat's milk, sit around the campfire, and just swing it back and forth for hours until it turned into yogurt and eventually butter, which was an absolute daily staple for desert survival. They also relied heavily on some seriously ingenious tools, like the threshing sledge. This was a heavy board with sharp basalt stones embedded in the bottom. They would drag it over freshly harvested stalks on windy hilltops just to break the grain loose. Then, using a winnowing fork, they'd toss the whole mixture up into the air. The breeze would carry away the useless chaff, and the heavier seeds would drop to the ground, finally ready to be ground into their daily bread. It was a life of just immense physical labor and incredible resourcefulness. So when we put it all together, the macro timeline, the circumstantial textual evidence, and these incredible artifacts of their grueling nomadic lifestyle, we really start to see how archaeology brings the ancient text to life. It makes these distant figures feel so much more tangible, and it reminds us that human endurance hasn't changed all that much over 4,000 years. Which leaves us with a pretty exciting thought. As archaeologists continue to literally dig through the dirt of the ancient Near East, what other missing pieces of this massive puzzle are just waiting down there to be uncovered? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.